So Scott, we've been introduced to the .NET CLI, and we've looked at some tooling. So we've looked at Visual Studio Code, we've looked at dependencies. Now, if I want to do more, if I want to try something else, can we try this in Visual Studio 2015?
Right. At this point, we're in Visual Studio Code. We use the command line interface, and we've got the basics of Hello World. But Visual Studio Code only goes so far. You can do basic debugging, but Visual Studio proper, or Visual Studio Community, that you can download for free, goes a little bit further. So let's go and switch over into Visual Studio. Visual Studio, I think of it as kind of like Office, right? It's your one integrated development environment that you spend all of your time in. So while in Visual Studio Code, we were jumping around a bit.
So is it like WordPad versus Word?
Word. It's kind of like Visual Studio Code is a code editor, does basic debugging, but the complete integrated IDE has profiling and debugging and database connectivity, and you can talk to the cloud. I mean, it's a whole thing. So it's going to give us some more things that we didn't have before. So like, for example, before we said .NET New and edited it.
Edited it. So here, would it be File New?
Right. So File, New, Project.
And we select from one of the templates.
Right. And in here, there's a bunch of templates indicating .NET Core or ASP.NET. And of course, I can do other things like Android and iOS for other kinds of things. But we're just going to say an ASP.NET Core web application. OK?
OK.
And when we get in here, there's a couple of choices. There's a full web application, or there's an empty one, which will look more like what we have right now.
So let's go ahead and start with that.
OK, so we'll do empty. So this is going to go create the application, and this will effectively do the same thing that we did before, but it's a web app, so it'll have a little bit.
It'll have a little bit more flesh to it.
A little bit more going on, but we can see if we open up the project.json that Kestrel's already in there. And actually, wait, look. Oh, we just see what it says packages. References here just said restoring. Actually, let's do this. I'm going to close this solution. I'm going to make another one because I want to catch it in the act. I'm making a fresh one. So watch where it says Solution Explorer over there on the right.
Yep.
Restoring
there it is.
packages. Restoring.
So this is the same as saying .NET Restore.
Exactly.
But Visual Studio is taking care of this for me.
And that list there is the same list from project.json. So remember before we were saying you don't really have to look in project.json?
This is it.
There. Exactly.
So let's say I want to build an application similar to this without having to build it up, but I want to do it in the command line.
Mm-hmm. So the way that you make a web application from the command line is you say .NET New again, but you indicate that the type is a web app.
OK, so it's the T stands for type.
Right. And remember that if you go .NET --help, it'll tell you stuff. And .NET New --help says language, the language of the project, F# or C#, and -T is type for the type of the project. And in the future, newer versions of .NET Core are going to have even more ways to make different kinds of apps from the command line. So not just console apps and web apps, but all kinds of things. So we'll say .NET New -T web. And look at that. Now we've got all that web stuff.
OK.
OK? And that'll be effectively the same thing that you'll get when you make a full web app in Visual Studio that we'll do in a little bit.
OK.
All right.
So we've restored our packages.
Mm-hmm.
So before, what we need to do is run our application.
Yeah, and we can run it just right from scratch. We don't have to do anything. We can just hit this little VCR button here.
VCR, but oh, whoa.
Sorry.
Hi, the 90s.
DVD, Blu-ray, I'm sorry.
No. It's like, it's all streaming now. It's just playing.
Oh, OK. It's just play. I'll push play.
It's just playing. So that drop down has a couple of options. What do those options mean? Because one of the things I'm beginning to notice, because I'm relatively new to the web, is that there are all these different ways that people run their applications. So I'm seeing IIS and I'm seeing Kestrel. What's the difference? When do I use them?
So Kestrel is the little cross-platform web server that works anywhere. And I'll actually go into Notepad here, and I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to go like this. So here's Kestrel. And Kestrel, remember, talks to .NET.
Okay.
And it calls .NET, .NET Run. And your web browser over here is going to make calls to Kestrel and say, hey, give me / Maria, or give me foo.jpg.
All right.
Okay? And Kestrel does that work. But you don't really today put Kestrel on the open internet. It's fine. You can probably do it. And in the future, that'll be totally allowed and certified. But if you're going to put an application into production, usually you'll have kind of a full production-ready web server, and you split the responsibilities. So maybe the images and the JPEGs and all of that stuff will be served by IIS.
Okay.
And then the pages
will be served by Kestrel.
Served by Kestrel. And then maybe later you'll go and have your pictures and stuff served by the cloud or whatever. But the point is that the web browser calls IIS, IIS calls Kestrel, which then coordinates this whole process. So it's about kind of responsibilities. But when you're doing kind of small applications at the command line, Kestrel works great. But there's also the Internet Information Server, or IIS. And IIS manages the life cycle of your application. So if Kestrel got knocked over or crashed, IIS would start it again.
Oh, okay.
Remember before we did .NET Watch, it was keeping track of .NET and making sure it was running. If I go and run Kestrel, but then something bad happens and it crashes, whose responsibility is it to bring it back? In this case, it's IIS.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So you can switch between IIS running your app or Kestrel.
So when I see my application name, like for right now you have Web Application 22, because you do like a ton of demos, that is Kestrel.
Yeah, and that's a little confusing because what you can do is there's a hidden file, not hidden, but not really visible, launch settings that controls that. So you see where it says profiles? This file here tells Visual Studio what to put in that menu. So here it says IIS Express is going to launch IIS Express, but Web Application 22 is going to be launch the project, which will be Kestrel. And there's an interesting way you can tell the difference. If I switch it to Web Application 22 and I'm going to say start without debugging.
Okay.
You see this right here. Control, I like to memorize. That's the one hotkey I know how to do. Control F5.
F5?
Yeah. I don't know all these other hotkeys, but Control F5, that's my friend. Hit Control F5. It goes and it builds my app. Oh, and did you watch
Something
that?
happened.
Look, see? That looks familiar, right?
Yeah, it does.
We did that.
We've done this.
So it launched that box, that little command prompt box. There's localhost 5000, and here we are. And that's Kestrel.
So if I went and edited that Hello World.
Oh, if you edited the Hello World while it was running? Would IIS, would Visual Studio know?
Right,
Let's
yeah.
find out. So Hello World, startup. No, because we don't have Watch. Because what it's doing is it's launching .NET Run. Okay, we don't have .NET Watch there. But if I switch this to IIS Express, hit Control F5, it's going to go into the build again. Now notice that there's no DOS box.
No.
I say DOS, it's not really DOS. But this little thing appeared down here.
Oh, that little tiny bit of stacks put together.
Yep, the little stacks down here. That is IIS Express. And IIS Express is this little local web server that is running my application. See?
Oh.
And you can have, IIS Express is, somewhat more powerful than Kestrel, but it's not. It's more about responsibilities. I can have multiple web applications being managed by IIS Express on different port numbers.
Okay, so how would you change a port, and why would you want to?
Well, let's say that I had an application that talked to another application where I had different responsibilities or different little tiny services that did different stuff. I might say that my app, maybe it's a game, has a shopping cart and a product catalog, and they're all on different ports because they're all individual applications. I would have multiple projects in Visual Studio, each one running on its own port.
Oh, so this is how like online stores are built.
Typically, you want to break up the responsibility, and if you're doing it in what's called microservices or tiny services, you'll have little tiny versions of those things running separately. Most people will run things in separate libraries and will have those projects all talking to each other. It depends on how separate you want things to be. But for most people, you'll probably just have one app on one port, but the option is there. Okay? The option is there. Now let's run that again because I wanted to confirm, is it going to tell
if we change
it? And it did.
It did.
So there's another benefit to running IIS with Visual Studio. You get that watch experience.
Without even knowing that it's happening.
Exactly, because IIS is handling that for us. Okay? All right. This project that we made here has a little bit different thing going on, doesn't it?
It does. And also I've noticed that there's the startup.cs class.
Yeah, so before we put things in one folder, in one file just to be convenient. But here it put startup in one location and it put program in another because they're getting a little big and we want to separate them. So here's program. We've added this line IIS integration. And that's the thing that hooked it up into IIS.
Yes. Okay.
That's a piece of middleware, and we'll talk about middleware.
We're going to talk about what middleware is.
Yeah. So that was added on there. And then it's also saying that the content is going to be served out of the current directory. It's saying that the root for all of our content is this current directory. But this is default. I just said file new project. I didn't have to.
It already came in. But could I essentially copy and paste this into our previous app and it should work?
That's a good point. So you could theoretically go over there, add IIS integration, make sure that the right packages are there, and upgrade
Upgrade your application.
to this level. Exactly. These are totally pluggable. So as you start to learn how these different building blocks snap together, you can absolutely move things between apps. And actually, if we can look at project.json, but instead I'll look right here. See? There's IIS integration. That was a package that was added. The addition of that package gave us the ability to talk to IIS.
Okay, so if we took it away, we wouldn't be able to do what we did.
And one other thing to remember for people who may be familiar with IIS, that originally ASP.NET had a thing called a web.config. Web.config and the configuration things that were inside it are largely no longer used in ASP.NET Core, but IIS knows about web.config. So if you want it to run on IIS, you're going to need this web.config with this module called the ASP.NET Core module. And this is the thing that launches .NET. See this here? That's the thing that launches .NET. So if we looked at a tree of processes, you'd see IIS, and you'd see it launch Kestrel and then launch .NET.
Okay.
Okay. So point is, if you need IIS, you're going to have that web config. But again, all done automatically. And if you're going to host it on Apache or somewhere that's not Windows, you don't need, that file doesn't
need to be there. Okay.
Exactly.
So we talked about ports. Now, if right now we are running off 5,000.
Yeah, I guess if we hit Control F5 on IIS.
Oh, we're actually running on something else.
Yeah. So IIS Express automatically picks a high port.
Okay.
By itself. But if you were running on Kestrel, we'll switch that over. We hit Control F5. See how it's picked 5,000 for me? And that's interesting because if I go out to the command line, so I'm running my app on 5,000 right now, right? And I think our original app was in Hello World. I just tried to run it.
But it's not letting you use it because the port's already in use.
Exactly. Address already in use. 5,000 is the default.
So let's switch it up.
Let's switch it up. So how do we do that?
So let's go over to the application properties. Oh, before we do that, let's add the use URLs. It's something I've been reading about.
Right. So we've got web host builder. Remember, we build up this sentence.
So, yep.
Yeah, and this is all one line. So there's another option, and where is it? Dot what?
Use URLs.
URLs.
So we're telling this application to use a specific URL.
Specify the URLs the web host will listen on.
And that's another cool thing about Visual Studio that will actually tell you a little bit more about the stuff.
Exactly. You'll get a little bit of documentation there. So we'll say like 8081. Just pick a port that's, not used. All right. And now I'm going to hit Control F5 and we'll see what happens. This might be interesting. So look at this.
It's defaulted to, it's listening.
It's listening on 8081.
But it's defaulting back to 5000.
Now this is a little bit subtle, but I figured it out recently, so I think I understand.
Okay.
.NET and ASP.NET ran that web server, and we just told it to go to localhost 8081. But .NET didn't launch the browser. Who launched the browser?
Kestrel.
The browser was launched by Visual Studio.
Visual Studio, so it had no idea.
So it's launching it on 5000. So who told it 5000, right? Remember that launch settings file. That launch JSON, that launch settings.json, that's the thing that says, hey, launch the browser. See, it actually says launch browser.
Yeah.
Look at that.
So I have to change that.
I have to change that there. Now, what the point is that it's about responsibilities. Maybe it'd be nice if I could change it in just one place. But in this case, the launch settings tells Visual Studio how to launch the browser, and the use URLs tells Kestrel which port to listen on. So there's client and server, and I'm actually going to say hello Kestrel because we're not on IIS anymore. Okay, so let's try that again. And a way to really kind of prove this and why that's so important is you notice that this is launching Microsoft Edge.
Yeah.
Let's find out why. We pull this down.
Browser.
This kind of speaks to the proof that Visual Studio's job was to launch the browser. So it's about the responsibilities, right?
You do this, you do that.
Exactly. So I'm going to change that to Chrome and see if that works. See? And it still works. So that launch settings controlled that port, and that is separate from what happened inside of program.cs, but I needed them to agree or it wouldn't have worked.
So is this the only way that you can edit the launch settings in Visual Studio?
No, that's a good question. What is another way?
So I feel if you right-click on your application and select Properties, and you select Debug,
yep,
you'll notice that it's been updated. So this is essentially, is it like a pretty UI to our launch settings?
Well, so you think about the project JSON and how that could stress someone out.
Yeah.
We saw the launch settings.json. That's a JSON file. Some people like doing things in text files, and that's totally cool. Other people prefer checkboxes and UIs and things like that. So what Visual Studio tries to do is give you the best of both worlds.
Okay.
Right? It's the visual in Visual Studio. So we can go and make changes here, and they will be reflected in the files underneath.
That's actually a really good phrase, the visual in Visual Studio.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your original work?
I'm going to take full credit for it right now. I've just decided.
Well, if people find out on Twitter?
Someone is going to go and find the original person who said that, and then I will be fired. All right. So this right now, so far, is just saying hello world. It's not really serving anything. Okay. Remember before we talked about responsibilities?
Yeah.
Serving JPEGs and serving HTML and stuff.
So, okay, we've seen hello world. And I want to, a lot of things about the web is HTML pages. Mm-hmm. So if I want to serve a basic HTML page, mm-hmm, would I just add it into this application?
Let's try.
All right. So I know you can just click on the application and add new.
Yeah, right click. Add new item.
And
see if there's some HTML around
client side.
HTML. What do we want to call it? Index.html. Okay. Hey folks, it's some static HTML.
Okay. So will this just work?
I don't know. Let's find out.
Let's find out.
So there it is. I can see it. We'll go and run the app. And I'm going to say /index.html. Now notice as I hit that, I'm hitting refresh, you can see the request. Look, request.
It's going out there.
Like more specifically, it knows. Kestrel saw it. See how it changed from being just slash to being slash index.html? But I know that that's not what's in there, so it's not working.
Yeah, it's actually going back to hello Kestrel. Now, why is that happening?
So we said when we configured our application, hey app, when you run,
Run.
write async.
Think.
That's the only thing it knows.
It's the only thing that knows how to do. So like we actually have to tell it to do something else.
Well, even more, the ASP.NET doesn't come out of the box knowing how to do really anything.
So you add what you need.
You add what you need. It's kind of a cafeteria plan. You show up with an empty plate, and by default, you can do nothing.
Like a buffet.
It's a buffet, exactly. So if we want to go and do something like talk to IIS, we added an IIS package. Let's add a way to do static files.
So they will add a static dependency?
We're going to add a dependency to a thing that's going to manage static files. Now, before, we did that in project.json.
Yeah.
But remember, we don't want to do that.
Oh, yeah, because we want to do the visual part of Visual Studio.
Exactly. So I'm going to right-click on references and say manage NuGet packages. NuGet, that is the name of a package that ASP.NET uses.
So I could just do a search. So even if I don't know the exact name.
That's a good point. Let's try that.
So if I looked at static.
You try static. You still kind of need to know the word static. Static files. You can search, and you see how we're searching through here. And you can notice which ones are from Microsoft and which ones aren't. You can see the number of downloads and hover over them and decide whether or not that's the thing that you want. So we can see Microsoft ASP.NET Core static files. I can see the versions, and I'm going to say install. Now when I do that, watch that right-hand side. See how it's got a little bang there?
Yeah.
And now it's okay.
Now it's working. So now we can, so this is a quick check. If we go to project.json, it should be listed there, right?
Excellent point. Let's check it out. Yep. It's as if we typed it there ourselves. And it called .NET Restore for us.
Without us having to
do anything. And to be even more specific, watch this. I'm going to actually take this line, delete it, and hit Control-S. We're going to save it. Watch the right-hand side. It's gone.
Wow.
See restoring packages, the yellow there? Now I'm going to hit Undo. Then I'll hit Control-S. And it comes back.
That's cool, because a lot of people who do not want to work in the project.json file, they can do this instead.
Exactly. So now if I go here and look at my list of installed stuff, this is actually nice because it's documenting what's going on. If you look at project.json, it'll tell you what each one of these things is for. Okay? All right. So now, surely that will just work.
Will it? Because it's still write async.
Yep, it actually won't work. So what do we need to do to make this happen?
So we need to because as we're building out our application, don't we need it to know that it needs to use the static files?
Exactly. So static files is a piece of middleware.
Okay.
And a middleware sits in this pipeline. So if we look at configure right now, it basically has nothing going on. It's got like a logger, something about an exception page, and it says run. So the only piece of middleware here is the
exception page?
No, well, yeah, it's a good point. That is a piece of middleware. That's a good point. We'll talk about that in a second. That's a middleware that happens if we're in development.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go over that. But this is really just the do it middleware. So we would need to go and say something like app.
Use and see the options that pop up?
So this is interesting. You see how use has a little square there, but these have a little down arrow. Those are extension methods. So by virtue of the fact that we added that new package, that function became available. Okay, and if I removed that package, that would get a squiggly there.
Okay.
Now, notice that I've got my run, and I've got use static files right there. So let's go ahead and run our application. And I'm going to say /index.html. And it still doesn't work.
Still doesn't work.
Why?
Is it in the right folder? Because shouldn't it be in the dub root folder? Because how else is it going to be served?
That could be it. Let's find out. So over here, we've got our CS files, and we've got our index, but we've got this folder called www.root. Let's pick up index.html and move it down. This is where our static content gets served from. Okay, you think that'll fix it?
Let's, fingers crossed.
No.
No, it did not.
Okay. Remember we said that it was a pipeline.
Yes.
Pipelines happen in order. There's segments to pipelines. So there's the first thing. And here's the second thing.
So it's not in order.
Not in order.
So if we move
this says, say hello world, period. Let's move this up. Now it's first in the pipeline. So static files gets a chance to work first.
So order does matter here.
Order absolutely matters, exactly. So let's go and try that. And notice that it's not the default document, right? If I say index. There we go. So then it served it. Now check this out. This is really important. Here's our first request to index.html. And look at that. Static files middleware sending file.
So,
and look at this. Request path, index.html, physical path, and then blah, 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 blah. So it's showing that relationship between the path in the URL and the path on the disk. Okay. All right. So in this case here, though, when I go to slash, I'm still getting that.
But once if I want...
well, what about I want the default document? Like, you know how you hit slash, you would expect index.html or, I don't know, default.
Yeah, or home.
Yeah, home, whatever. Some default file that gets served up when you hit slash.
Yeah.
Okay. So static files middleware includes a bunch of stuff. And I remember when we were going around down here in use, there was other stuff.
I saw something like default files and...
Yeah, use default files. I saw use file server. And look at this one here. See how I'm hovering and we get that instructions like you said. Enable all static file middleware except directory browsing. So let's try use file server instead of use static files. So we're going to get a little bit more functionality. And let's see if this works. And I'm going to switch it. We're going to stay on Kestrel, and we'll hit Control F5. There we go. So look here. Is that index? No, yeah, see?
It's still, so it went directly.
Right, so that became our default document. Okay. If the file exists, it uses it, otherwise it doesn't. Okay. But what if I didn't want that? What if I call this application, let's call index like foo. And let me get rid of this. I'm just going to comment that out. Let's run this again. So there's a 404, right? Couldn't find it because we named it
foo.
Foo. But when I go to the default, I'm getting
an error.
An error. Maybe I would want a list of what's in that folder, like a directory.
The directory of what exists.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can even put some files in there. See if we can get one of those files served. I want to see if it does PNGs also. Does.
Does, okay.
Okay. So I want to see a listing
of all the things that exist in your directory.
Mm-hmm. So remember when we said use file server, it said enable all middleware except directory browsing.
Okay.
That means there must be directory browsing out there. There we go. Okay. Use directory browser.
Oh.
Okay. Enable directory browsing on the current path. And then there's optional
Sense of what you can
options you can pass in. Okay. Now let's see if that's the magic bullet that will make everything okay. All right. Or something horrible will happen and things will blow up. All right. Things are blowing up. Let's find out why. Unable to resolve service for HTML encoder while attempting to activate directory browser middleware. So it wanted something while it was doing something else.
Okay.
What do we think is going on? What do you think?
Well,
when you want to make a directory browser page, I'm imagining that it's going to have to go through all the files and build some HTML up and make a table.
yes. But where does that come from? Where does that page come from?
Well, somebody had to write that, and it said that it needed to have middleware to do that, and the middleware probably needed some functions,
Like some sort of service.
some sort of service that was available. And in this case here, if you remember, it actually said something very specific that was interesting. It said, unable to resolve service HTML encoder. So the one service needed the other service. Did we set something up incorrectly?
Or did we miss something?
Mm-hmm. So remember, there's configure, where we build up our app. Our apps use services that they pull from all over.
The place.
But services have services that they use. So for example, this middleware directory browser has a service and some internal stuff that it needs in order to make HTML. So up here, when we say services,
Add directory browser.
yeah. So what this does is it says,
Does it have options?
adds the directory browser middleware services. It's basically saying these are all the things that are needed. And in fact, if I want to be really fancy, we can go up and look at like GitHub and look at the ASP.NET static files middleware. You can go and do this. This is what's great about open source now, right? We can go and find the code and find the function that does add directory browser and figure out what's going on.
What's
you can
in there.
read this code. So it turns out that some services, like directory browser, need others, like how to make HTML. Yeah.
So we have the things that build our application, but then they also need services for them to actually just function.
And a low-level service might be something like making HTML, or it might be something higher level, like how to use cookies or whatever. And we'll learn more about that when we make custom middleware. So let's run this now and see if it works. All right, look at that.
So it does work, and even has a timestamp.
That's fancy. So it basically, somewhere there's some code that went and for each file in the directory.
Do this. So that means when I look at things like this, it looks like something I could possibly make.
That's a really good point. We could probably go so far as to find that static file middleware and figure out who wrote it and write our own. So for example, here we go, directory browser, directory, HTML directory formatter. Look at that.
There it is.
There it is. There is, yep, look, somebody had to make a table.
So it's not magic.
Nothing in .NET is magic. It may have been in the past, where this idea of this black box that you poke at, but you can't open and look inside. But here you can.
And then every single thing that we've put into our application, we've actually built up. It's all pieces that we're bringing together like a puzzle.
Exactly right. And if you don't have those pieces, it either won't compile or won't run. And you have complete and total power. So notice that we couldn't serve static files unless we said it was okay.
Okay.
We couldn't make a directory browser unless we said it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that's a big deal.
But one thing I've noticed when you go back to the command line, if you bring it up,
Oh, when I run that app?
when you run the
that
application, is that there's always a thing of the hosting environment is development.
Yes, it's saying right before it starts the app. You notice that here's where the app starts, but there's a little bit of setup, yeah. So you've noticed that hosting environment development has come up.
Has come up every single time we're running an application.
Indeed. And you mentioned before this piece of middleware that only happens in
Development.
development. Yeah, interesting. In fact, that's a piece of middleware, and that's a piece of middleware as well. And if we go, let's go ahead and remove that, and let's go back to our hello world. So there's hello Kestrel. Oops. And let's run that again just to make sure that that works, and it'll still say development. Okay? So remember before you had me go to properties.
Yeah. There it is.
All right.
It's the environment variable.
So let's change it to something else. What do you want to change it to?
Production.
Okay, production. And then I'll hit save. Oh, interesting. Look at this. It says this file, launch settings, has changed. That's because we happen to have it open. Yeah. So look.
So if I go to launch settings, it should.
Ah, this is really interesting. Look at this.
So I have two.
We did something funny. We made Kestrel Production and IIS development. Maybe we do that the opposite way, right?
Okay.
But that's fine.
Why did that happen?
Well, so we changed the properties for the current web server, or the current launch options. So we have this, these are called profiles. We have this one selected. So when we looked at the properties page, we were changing it for that one. If we switch it to IIS Express, and then go back here, and then go properties.
Could you go and click on the profile at the...
Yeah, hang on. Hit properties. Now it says development. Okay, because this is IIS Express profile. And if you look right here, you can switch it as well.
Right there.
See, production, development. Okay, so what? What do you do with that? Why do we care?
Why is this important?
What do you think?
Well,
Go ahead.
So when I think about it, it's basically when you're kind of testing an application, wouldn't you want to test some things in development?
Exactly. So you're going to want a developer exception page. You're going to want details about why a crash happened.
Why a crash happened. So a lot of testing. But then we also have the concept of staging.
Yeah. So some people might have something simplistic, like I'm a one-person shop. I've got development and production.
That's it.
But if I'm a big company, I might have dev, test, staging, production. I don't know. They could have many
different.
I suppose, what if we did this? I don't even know if this is possible. What if we just said down here where it says environment fancy production? Why not, right?
Yep.
That could be a thing. Because I might have multiple clouds or multiple web servers. Yep, see, fancy production. So it looks like hosting environment really is up to you to decide.
It's up to you.
Okay. But we think of some of them. Let's go ahead and back to say development. Some of them matter. That's going to keep bothering me until I close that file. There we go. See this environment here, this hosting environment?
Yep.
So dev, production, and staging are kind of official things.
Official things. Okay.
But remember how we said that there's no magic? We could probably go over into the source code.
And add one of our own?
Well, we could add one of our own to our own application. We could just make the changes ourselves or look ourselves. But what we could also do is if we had a question about like what is development is, like maybe that's complicated or fancy. It's actually not. It's probably just...
That's it.
You know what I mean? It's just a check to see the text about development. But it's convenient, right? So in this case here, we're saying if the environment is development, do this. Let's try something else.
So print it out onto a web page?
Well, let's do two things.
Okay.
First, let's do the stupidest thing I can think of, which is if it's development, do this. This is horrible, by the way.
Okay.
And you're going to show me a better way, because this is bad. All right? So if it's development, do that. Otherwise, it's do that. That's pretty horrible. Okay. All right.
All right.
So that works. But your face kind of squinched up.
I feel like there could be a nicer way to look at this.
It's okay. I don't feel bad. You can insult my code. What's a nicer way to maybe do that?
So I kind of thinking when you introduced us to the $sign earlier.
Ah, yes, having strings that have stuff within the string.
Within the string. Mm-hmm. So could we theoretically, in response.writeAsync, could I write something like $, quotes?
Okay, so there's $, and then you're going to have a variable here somewhere. Where is the name of the current environment living? Where is that available to us?
Oh, we need to create an environment name.
Well, we have the iHosting environment, right?
But in iHosting environment, if you have dot, there should be an option that is...
So that's a good point. So you can do two things. You can say env dot, and you can ask questions.
Like,
you can also right-click on any one of the things you want to ask a question of, and you can say, go to definition, and you can see
all the strings.
Look, see, it actually kind of auto-generates this. So I'll do that again just to make sure you're clear.
Yeah, let's look at that again.
Anything here that's blue, right? That's an interface that we know about. I can right-click on it and I can say
go to definition.
Go to definition, and it tells me that there's the name of the application, the root path, and the environment name.
So it shows you everything that exists within this.
That's exactly what you would see when you go env, except the extensions. You see how is development and those things didn't pop in?
Yeah.
They are extension methods. They're helper functions. They're not part of the interface.
Okay.
Ah, okay. All right. So env has what we need. Let's grab it. We thought environment name?
Yeah, environment name.
Okay.
And let's see if that works.
Should. Crossing fingers. Compile and run. There you go. And to prove that it works,
I'm going to change the environment.
Make it Fancy Production again, because I think I like the idea of having one called Fancy Production. Yeah, I know.
There.
So we could do all sorts of things with that now. Now that we can have our application do different stuff based on being in production versus in development or staging. For example, imagine if you were making a shopping cart and you want to debug information, it could appear at the bottom of the page. It tells you about the shopping cart, but only in development.
Only in development.
Right, because you wouldn't want to have people see...
No, you wouldn't want them to see that. You wouldn't want to see them. You wouldn't want them to see that something's out of stock.
Yeah, but you might want to keep that information secretly to yourself.
To yourself.
Make sense?
Makes sense.
All right. So that's the basics of environments.
Middleware.
Yeah, small amount of middleware. We'll do custom middleware in a little bit.
And we did have a look at ASP.NET Core.
And then we will come back in a moment and talk a little bit more about the configuration system.
All right, looking forward to it.